Have you ever felt like something inside you is broken, yet you can't name what it is? You go about your life, do what you're supposed to, even smile when others are watching, but somewhere deep beneath the surface, there's a constant sense of disconnection. It's not just sadness, it's not just stress, it's the quiet ache of being a stranger to yourself. You keep moving forward, but nothing truly moves within, and every time you sit still for too long, the silence begins to whisper things you're not ready to hear. Carl Jung once pointed to a profound truth. He said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That avoidance, that internal escape, is what keeps so many people locked inside an invisible prison. A prison made not of steel bars, but of repressed memories, denied emotions, and forgotten truths. You were not born broken, but over time, life taught you to fragment yourself. It taught you to hide the parts of you that were too sensitive, too loud, too angry, too tender, too wild, or too weird. Maybe you were told not to cry, or not to speak up. Maybe you learned that your feelings were too much, or that love was something you had to earn by shrinking who you were. Slowly, piece by piece, the real you was buried. But here's the thing, what you bury does not die. It waits. It waits in your dreams, in the patterns you repeat, in the relationships that haunt you, and in the unexplained triggers that hijack your emotions. It waits in the loneliness you feel, even when you're not alone. It waits in the shame you can't explain. It waits not to punish you, but to be reclaimed. And until you face it, you will continue to feel like a ghost inside your own life. This is not a poetic metaphor. This is psychological reality. According to Jungian psychology, the unconscious mind is not just a repository of suppressed memories. It is a living force within you. And when you ignore it, it does not remain silent. It speaks through anxiety. It cries through depression. It lashes out through projection. It sabotages you, not out of cruelty, but because it is desperate to be heard. So let me ask you something that you may have never asked yourself. What part of you have you abandoned? What part of you did you decide was unworthy of love, attention, or presence? And what has the cost been of keeping that part of you locked away? This is the core of Jung's insight. The wound is not just the pain itself. The real wound is the split between who you are and who you think you're allowed to be. And unless that split is healed, you will always carry the sense that something is missing, even when everything on the outside looks fine. People try to fix this emptiness in all kinds of ways. They chase careers, relationships, accomplishments. They accumulate distractions. But nothing external can replace the self that was exiled. The truth is difficult, but freeing. You are not waiting for someone to fix you. You are waiting for yourself to return. In the next few minutes, we are going to go deeper into the parts of you that the world taught you to ignore. We will explore the nature of the shadow. We will uncover how your unconscious shapes your daily decisions. And most importantly, we will walk through the exact reason why, if you keep turning away from your inner truth, you will stay stuck in the same cycles that keep you broken. But if you choose to face it, if you choose to listen, if you choose to meet the part of you that has been abandoned, then everything can begin to change. Are you ready to stop running? Before we continue, I want you to pause for just a moment and ask yourself this. What part of you have you been pretending doesn't exist? Is it a version of you that felt too emotional, too angry, too soft, too wild, or maybe just too real? If something came to mind, no matter how faint or buried it felt, write it down in the comments. You don't need to explain it, just give it a name. Naming is the first step to remembering. And sometimes, healing begins with simply admitting what we've forgotten. There is a fracture inside you that no X-ray can detect. It doesn't show up in blood tests or brain scans. It doesn't scream loud enough to be recognized as an emergency. But it quietly affects everything. Your mood, your decisions, your relationships, even the way you see yourself in the mirror. It's the fracture of the psyche, and most people live their entire lives without realizing that it's there. Carl Jung believed that the human mind is not a unified force, but a complex system of parts, some visible, some hidden, some completely unconscious. And what you see as your personality is often just the polished surface. Underneath it lives the rest of you, the rejected, the forgotten, the silenced, and the wounded. These parts form what Jung called the unconscious, but they don't stay there passively. they influence you constantly. Every time you overreact to something that seems minor, every time you withdraw from intimacy for reasons you can't explain, every time you find yourself repeating a mistake you swore you'd never make again, these are not accidents, these are signals. They are the language of the parts of you that were never given a voice. This is not abstract philosophy, it's the foundation of emotional suffering. According to modern psychological studies on dissociation and repression, the brain doesn't forget trauma. It simply tucks it away in corners of the mind that you stop visiting. But what is hidden is not healed. It festers, and over time, it shapes how you respond to the world. You begin to form relationships, not based on love, but on survival. You begin to make choices, not out of freedom but from fear. So how does this fracture happen in the first place? Often it begins in childhood. A child learns very early which parts of themselves are acceptable and which are not. If you cried too much, maybe you were told you were weak. If you asked too many questions, maybe you were labeled difficult. If you got angry, maybe you were punished or ignored. So you adapted. You learned to show only what was rewarded and to bury the rest. That buried self didn't vanish. It simply became unconscious, but it never stopped wanting to be seen. Jung understood that the unconscious has a natural drive toward wholeness. It doesn't want to stay hidden. It pushes upward, trying to break through. And if you ignore it, it will manifest in ways that feel like chaos. You'll sabotage opportunities. You'll feel inexplicable shame. You'll project your own denied emotions onto other people, blaming them for feelings that were yours all along. This is where the quote makes perfect sense. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Think about that. How many things in your life have you chalked up to bad luck or timing, when in truth, they were patterns rooted in parts of you you've never truly examined? Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you reacted so strongly to something small that even you didn't understand why? Maybe someone criticized you gently, and you felt like your entire sense of self collapsed. Maybe someone ignored your message, and you spiraled into a storm of self-doubt. That's the unconscious speaking. That's the fracture bleeding through the mask. If you've experienced this, and most people have, you are not broken beyond repair. You are simply incomplete. And that incompleteness is not a flaw. It is an invitation to begin the most important journey of your life, the journey of self-recovery. So before we move into the next part of this video, take a moment and reflect. Can you identify one pattern, one recurring emotional response that feels familiar but unexplainable? Something that might not originate in the present moment, but in something you've never fully faced? If so, write it in the comments. You don't need to solve it right now. You just need to see it. Awareness is always the beginning. What if I told you that the very parts of yourself you're most afraid of are the parts that could set you free? You were taught to fear your anger, to hide your sadness, to feel shame about your desires, and to suppress your intensity. You were told that being too much, too emotional, too unpredictable would push people away. So you learned to smile when you were in pain. You learned to stay quiet when your soul wanted to scream. And you wore that mask so well, even you began to forget who you really were underneath. But the truth is, those buried parts of you never disappeared. They simply became what Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow is everything about you that you've rejected. It holds not only your shame and fear, but also your creativity, your confidence, your boundaries, your desire to live fully. It's not just a place of darkness, it's a place of potential. Jung understood that ignoring the shadow is like trying to walk through life with half your body. You may look functional on the outside, but inside, you're limping. What lives in your shadow is not inherently evil. It is only dangerous when it's denied. The shadow grows darker, not because of what it contains, but because of how long it has been hidden. And the longer it remains unconscious, the more it begins to control your life in ways you don't realize. Let's bring this into reality. Have you ever met someone who seems overly kind, almost painfully agreeable, someone who avoids conflict at all costs? And then one day that person explodes. Rage, bitterness, resentment pouring out like a dam that finally cracked. That's the shadow erupting. Years of suppressed anger finally making its way to the surface. Or maybe you've noticed it in yourself. A sudden wave of jealousy that doesn't make sense. An urge to self-sabotage just when things are going well. A harsh inner voice that seems to come out of nowhere. These are not random flaws, they are clues, traces of the parts of you that were pushed into exile, now trying to return. In modern psychology, shadow work is recognized as a powerful tool in trauma healing and identity integration. Studies in internal family systems, somatic therapy, and Jungian analysis show that when individuals begin to accept and dialogue with their hidden parts, anxiety decreases, self-trust increases, and emotional resilience deepens. You do not heal by deleting the past, you heal by meeting it with compassion and understanding. But here's the challenge. Facing your shadow isn't comfortable. It requires brutal honesty. It means owning thoughts and impulses you'd rather not admit. It means accepting that sometimes you are not the victim, but the one who caused harm. It means realizing that the version of you that has been playing nice and staying small was not your true self, but your safest self. And still, the reward is extraordinary. Because once you face your shadow, you reclaim your power. You stop being manipulated by your unconscious. You begin to see yourself with clarity, not as a fixed identity, but as a dynamic whole. You become less reactive, more intentional. You stop fearing the parts of yourself that once felt uncontrollable. So I ask you now, not with judgment, but with curiosity. What lives in your shadow? Is it rage you never learned to express? Is it the part of you that always wanted to say no, but didn't? Is it a sexual desire you were told was wrong? Is it a voice that wanted to lead but was taught to stay quiet? You don't have to confess it out loud, but take a moment and acknowledge it, because once you name it, it can no longer control you from the dark. Write just one word, just one in the comments that represents something you've been taught to hide about yourself. One piece of truth you want to reclaim. Let it be messy, let it be real, because wholeness does not begin with perfection, it begins with honesty. Most people never heal, not because they cannot, but because they're afraid to look in the mirror. Healing isn't blocked by a lack of knowledge or support. It is blocked by resistance, a deep psychological resistance to seeing the truth about ourselves. That truth is not always ugly. In fact, what frightens people the most isn't their darkness, it's the realization of how much of themselves they've abandoned just to survive. Carl Jung understood this with surgical precision. He saw that the ego, the part of us that creates our conscious identity, will go to great lengths to protect its illusion of control. The ego wants to feel safe. It wants to feel right. It doesn't care if we're happy, whole, or even alive in the fullest sense. It only cares about keeping things familiar. So even if you are miserable, the ego will choose misery over change, because change means death to the ego's illusion. This is why most people stay stuck. They build a life around avoiding themselves. They construct routines, roles, even entire personalities, not to express their truth, but to avoid it. And they do this so well, they begin to confuse the mask with the face beneath it. The roles become identities, the trauma becomes personality, the wound becomes home. You've probably seen this happen. You may have felt it. That moment when you almost told the truth. That moment when you almost left the relationship, admitted the secret, quit the job, or asked for help. But you didn't. Something held you back. Something whispered, "What if you can't handle what comes next?" That whisper was fear. Not the fear of pain, but the fear of freedom. Because freedom means no more excuses. It means you can no longer blame your past for your future. It means you have to take responsibility for the life you've been avoiding. And responsibility is terrifying when you've spent your life surviving. This is why so many people sabotage their healing, not consciously, but instinctively. They start therapy and then ghost their therapist. They begin journaling and then stop the moment it gets uncomfortable. They open up in a conversation, then quickly laugh it off. They begin to wake up and then retreat, because the mirror doesn't lie. It reflects not only what you've become, but what you could be, and that gap can feel unbearable. Modern psychology describes this as cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when our current behavior or self-image doesn't match our inner truth. Instead of facing it, people distract themselves. They binge content, seek validation, accumulate achievements. But none of these things bring peace, because the real wound is not external. It's the split between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. Jung warned that without this confrontation, healing remains impossible. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he wrote. And yet that pain is not there to punish you. It is there to wake you up, to shake you from the trance of avoidance. to remind you that there is something inside you worth rescuing. So let me ask you directly, what truth about yourself have you been avoiding? Not because you don't see it, but because you're not sure what would happen if you faced it. What would your life look like if you stopped blaming your circumstances and started confronting your inner reality? You don't need to fix it all today. You don't need to unpack every memory or forgive every wound, but you do need to begin looking in the mirror with compassion, with courage, with the quiet understanding that healing is not about becoming someone new. It is about finally allowing yourself to be someone whole. If this speaks to something inside you, write it down in the comments. What part of your truth feels too sharp to touch, but too real to keep denying? You don't have to explain it. Just admit to yourself that it's there and that you are finally ready to see it. To become whole is not to become perfect. It is to reclaim the pieces of yourself that you once pushed away in order to feel accepted, safe, or loved. Integration is the process of returning to yourself, not as a version shaped by fear or approval, but as the original self that existed before the world taught you to hide. Carl Jung called this journey individuation, and it is the cornerstone of psychological maturity. Individuation is not self-improvement, it is self-reunion. It is the long and often painful walk back into your own soul, not to change who you are, but to remember what was lost. To begin this path, you must first recognize that the parts of you you've been taught to avoid are not your enemies. Your anger is not just a problem, it is a signal. Your fear is not a weakness, it is a messenger. Your envy is not evil, it is a clue to what you desire but don't believe you deserve. Integration requires you to turn toward these uncomfortable feelings, not to be consumed by them, but to understand them. Modern neuroscience supports this process. Studies in trauma recovery and emotional processing show that awareness reduces reactivity. The brain is not a static machine, it is neuroplastic. This means it can rewire itself when you introduce new ways of seeing and responding to your inner world. When you stop rejecting your emotions and begin to welcome them, even gently, your entire nervous system begins to shift. What once felt chaotic becomes meaningful. What once triggered you now teaches you. But this takes courage, because when you begin to listen to the parts of yourself that you've ignored, you uncover memories, stories and truths that may feel uncomfortable or even overwhelming. You might discover that your ambition was built on a need for approval, that your kindness was a shield for fear of conflict, that your independence was born from abandonment. These insights can hurt, but they are sacred, because in that pain lies the possibility of transformation. Jung often spoke of alchemy as a metaphor for integration. In ancient alchemy, the goal was to turn base metals into gold, but Jung saw this as a symbol for psychological transformation. The base metal is your shadow, your hidden self. The gold is your conscious whole identity, and the process of transformation happens through fire, through heat, pressure, and awareness. You cannot skip this process. You cannot become gold without first embracing the lead. You may wonder how to begin. It does not require a ritual. It does not require a perfect plan. It requires honesty. It requires time alone without distraction. It requires a journal, a conversation with someone who listens without judgment, or a quiet moment when you ask yourself a question and actually stay long enough to hear the answer. Ask yourself, what am I afraid to feel? What am I pretending not to know? What part of me have I made wrong just to be accepted? And if I allowed that part to speak, what would it say? This is where integration begins, in small, honest moments, in catching yourself before the familiar reaction, in choosing a pause instead of a performance, in learning to say no, not out of rebellion, but out of self-respect, in learning to say yes, not to please others, but to honor yourself. You are not a puzzle with missing pieces. You are a complete mosaic, waiting to be reassembled. Integration doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, like dawn breaking over a dark field. It begins in shadow and slowly brings everything into light. So now take a breath and reflect. What is one part of yourself that you've judged, feared, or rejected, but that you are ready to welcome back? Write it in the comments. Not for anyone else, for you. Because the journey of becoming whole begins the moment you say, I am willing to know all of me. There is a story you've been living, even if you've never realized it. It is stitched together by your fears, your habits, your early experiences, and the identities you've adopted along the way. Most people never question the plot of their own lives. They move through the chapters blindly, repeating the same themes, playing the same roles, stuck in a narrative they didn't choose. Carl Jung called this the personal myth, the silent script that governs how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. But what if the story you've been telling yourself is incomplete? What if the plot twist you've been avoiding is the one that would finally make the story make sense? You are not just a character, you are also the narrator. And once you begin to see yourself from that perspective, everything changes. The pain you've carried begins to take shape as a meaningful challenge, not just a punishment. The people who have hurt you become part of a larger arc, lessons, not definitions. Your flaws turn into symbols of transformation. You stop seeing your life as something that happened to you and begin seeing it as something you're actively creating. Jung believed that healing requires more than insight. It requires the formation of meaning. Without meaning, pain becomes unbearable. But when you begin to find a thread that connects your suffering to something greater than yourself, that suffering transforms. It becomes purpose. This is the difference between living reactively and living consciously. Living reactively means being driven by emotion, triggered by the past, and always one step behind your own behavior. Living consciously means choosing with awareness. It means taking time to ask, is this decision aligned with who I really am? And more importantly, who am I becoming through this experience? We live in a time where people are more informed than ever, but rarely take time to reflect on their own myths. They know the news, they know trends, but do they know what story they're actually living? Do you? Are you living the myth of the wounded child who never got what they needed and now unconsciously seeks validation from every relationship? Are you living the myth of the warrior, constantly fighting, always strong but never allowed to rest? Or maybe you're living the myth of the exile, always on the outside, believing you don't belong, when in truth, you've never given yourself permission to enter. Recognizing your myth is not about labeling yourself, it's about reclaiming authorship. The moment you realize you've been living inside a story is the moment you realize you have the power to rewrite it. You do not have to stay loyal to a version of yourself that was born from survival. You can choose to evolve. You can write a new chapter. This is not just self-help rhetoric. Meaning-making is at the center of psychological health. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust and a psychiatrist, discovered that those who survived extreme trauma often did so not because of physical strength, but because they held on to a sense of meaning. They believed their suffering had a purpose, and purpose, when chosen consciously, becomes the spine of the story that sustains you. So I ask you now, gently but clearly, what story are you living? Not the one you show others, but the one you silently tell yourself when you're alone. Is it one of limitation, or one of potential, one of fear, or one of becoming? And what story would you write if you knew no one was watching? If the only person you had to please was the version of yourself who still remembers what it feels like to be whole? Write that story's name in the comments. Just a phrase, a symbol, a sentence. Let that be the seed. Let that be the moment you stop being a character and start being the creator. You were never meant to stay broken. The cracks in your soul were never the end of your story. They were the beginning. Because healing is not about erasing the pain. It is about finding the meaning within it. It is about realizing that every wound you've ever carried was not just a scar but a seed. Something that once understood could grow into something beautiful, something real, something you. Carl Jung believed that wholeness is not achieved by becoming pure, but by embracing your totality. That means light and shadow, love and rage, certainty and doubt. The goal is not to become someone different, it is to become someone true. The process of healing does not make you flawless, it makes you fully alive. You are not broken because you feel deeply. You are not broken because you struggle to trust. You are not broken because you've made mistakes, or because your mind feels like a battlefield. These are signs that you are still in motion, that your story is still unfolding, that you are someone who refuses to stay numb, even when feeling hurts. The pain you've carried might not have been your fault, but your healing is your responsibility, and not because you owe it to the world, but because you owe it to the version of you who once believed they didn't deserve peace. You are not here to simply cope, you are here to create, to feel, to grow, to transform the weight you've been carrying into wisdom that others will one day lean on. There is a strange beauty in the way life breaks us open. Often, it is only when we reach the edge of ourselves that we begin to see what lies beyond. The old patterns shatter, the false identities fall away, and in that quiet, terrifying, liberating space, we finally meet the self we had forgotten, the one who was waiting all along. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a lived experience. It is the process of dying to the illusions we've clung to, and being reborn as someone who no longer fears their own reflection, someone who no longer asks for permission to exist, someone who stands in the middle of their brokenness and says, "This too is me." Modern psychology confirms that post-traumatic growth is real. People who have faced immense psychological pain often emerge with deeper compassion, greater clarity, and a stronger sense of purpose. The darkness, when navigated with courage, does not destroy, it initiates. So look at your life, not as a list of failures, but as a map. Every regret, every loss, every tear that felt wasted, these were not detours, they were directions. They were guiding you back to something you've always known, that your worth is not in your perfection, but in your presence. The world does not need another perfect mask. It needs real people. People who have walked through the fire and come out carrying light. People who are willing to be seen, not just for their successes, but for their scars. People like you. So let me ask you one final question. What have you been telling yourself is too broken to be healed? What would happen if you stopped believing that lie and started believing in your own becoming? Not because it's easy, but because you are worth the effort. Write it down in the comments. Write what you're letting go of. Write what you're reclaiming. Write the part of yourself that you're finally ready to stop hiding. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be true. Because once you speak it, once you bring it out of the shadows, you begin to carry that light, not just for yourself, but for everyone still searching in the dark.